Okay, here we go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Metabolic Studios Learning and Mending Tending the Commons. I'm Jen, and we're going to start this evening first with a quick little intro of what we're working on. But before I do that, actually, let me back up 1 second, and we're going to feature this week's embroidery of the week. And I just want to say that this embroidery wins the award for the most stitches to date. Yes, yes, it is you. It is you. Our embroiderer is here tonight. It is Olan Jones, and this is her masterpiece. And I lost
Wow.
count at the number of
Wow.
stitches. This is truly extraordinary in person. I hope that it
Wow.
conveys that to you guys, but um,
1 million. There are 1 million stitches, I'm pretty sure.
it's just it's so, oh my gosh, it's so magical, so magical. So um thank you so much for that, and we will get you a new kit, um so you can continue. Oh, you already have your new one already. Great, wonderful. And so now we'll do a quick introduction. I'm Jen. I use she, her pronouns. And tonight I will be continuing my bird, which I thought I would get more done on my little road trip. But turns out it's not as easy to embroider in the dark in the car as one might think. So this is as far as I got. And now I'm going to pass it over to Linda, where you can introduce yourself and share what you're working on and pass it to somebody else.
Hi, I'm Linda. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm located in Los Altos in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I have made a little bit of progress because I had a road trip opportunity on this mycelium carbon exchange network. And I'll pass it along to Izzy.
Hi, Linda. Hi, everyone. My name's Izzy. My pronouns are they, she. I'm calling from East Hollywood, and I'm going to grab my embroidery, but tonight I will be doing some guided breath work and reading and chatting with everyone, and looking forward to it. I will pass it on to Kavi.
Thanks, Izzy. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Kaviola here, calling in from Sacramento. My pronouns are he, him, and I'll be sharing the screen tonight and really looking forward to tonight's reading as well. I'll pass it over to Kate.
Hi, I'm Kate, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling from Pasadena, and I am working on white sage. And I will pass it over to Emily.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everyone. Happy to be with you here. I am in Payahunadu, so-called Owens Valley. And I am excited to share some sounds with you tonight here at the end of the reading. Got some exciting materials here laid out for tonight's special meditation. Pronouns are she, her. And yeah, just happy to be here and keep the ritual of this space going. Let me pass it over to my friend Lee Adams. Lee, you're muted. We want to hear your beautiful voice.
Okay, that should be better. Hi, I'm Lee Adams, and I use she, her pronouns. I am in Altadena in COVID quarantine. While I'm healthy and strong, I have to be careful because I've been exposed. So I'm being socially conscious and responsible, and I am working on a mosaic. I don't know if I can show it to you, but I will give it a try. You let me know if that is showing. Nope. No, it didn't. Maybe I can drop a photo into the chat.
That would be great.
And mortar and thread don't mix, so I'm just mosaicing tonight. And let me pass it to Olan.
Thank you, Lee. I am Olan. I'm using she, her programs, pronouns. And I'm in Kalinga, driving back from Northern California. And I'm working on the mycelium carbon creature here, a brand new one that I may be forced to put another 1 million stitches into. And let me go to gallery. I'll pass it on to Louisa.
Hi, I'm Louisa. I use she, her pronouns as well. This is my first time attending, and actually, I think my mom may have come by before, and she started working on the Raven for me, but I'm trying to finish it up. Yeah, and I'm just excited to see what this is like. I forgot to pass it. I will pass it to Vicky.
Hi there, my name is Vicky. I'm in Santa Monica and I use she, her pronouns. And last time we met, I did finish mending my dress. And I also made the beginning of my January 22 calendar because I'm used to getting all that in the mail and it hasn't come yet this year either, not even my college one. So I'm feeling completely unable to manage the new year right now and scheduling. So, and tonight I'm just going to probably read and listen because my eyes are a little tired. And Linda, have you gone?
Actually,
You did go?
I'll just take it over from here right now. Thank you, Vicky, and
Sure.
welcome everybody. And if you didn't get an opportunity to introduce yourself, there will be time later this evening during discussion to introduce and share what you're working on and your thoughts about the reading. We are in the 8th week of this series. So in this series, Tending the Commons, we will be exploring how the commons can be an alternative approach to the destructive nature of capitalism, where individual and short-term gains have been prioritized over common and long-term good. We'll be asking questions like, what are the commons? What does this look like? And how do social relations shift within the commons? In what ways do the commons resist the simulated scarcity of capitalism? This is the 6th iteration of Learning and Mending, following syllabi on abolitionist writing, indigenous perspectives of land stewardship, suffocation, Anna Tsing's The Mushroom at the End of the World, and system thinking. In many ways, this series is a continuation of what preceded it. We've examined alternatives to capitalism and its destructive, corrosive nature in the previous syllabi. But in this series, we're specifically looking at the alternative to capitalism, that is the commons. Many of you have received embroidery kits from us of native plants, birds, and microscopic organisms that the Metabolic Studio is currently cultivating on its project sites. Taken as a collection, all of these embroideries will collectively illustrate biogeoconosis, which describes the intimate association between living things and the physical environment. If you've not received an embroidery kit, or you'd like to receive another one, please send your name and mailing address to info@metabolicstudio.org. Tonight, we will share our screen, and we encourage you to read a section of the text aloud with us. When there is a pause in the reading, please feel free to unmute yourself and begin where the last person left off. Silence is golden, and there is no pressure to fill the transitional spaces while we enjoy a breath and continue crafting. Feel free to jump in and continue reading at your comfort level. You don't have to read, it's also fine to enjoy listening. And now I will pass it over to Izzy, and she will continue with this evening's program.
Thank you, Jen. So tonight, before we get started with the reading, we're just going to do a little guided breath work. So please find yourself in a comfortable seated position and close your eyes and take a deep inhale, inviting in breath with open lungs. And as you exhale, release, root down, let yourself feel grounded in your seat. On the next inhale, lift the crown of your head up towards the sky. And as you exhale, melt the shoulders down and away from the ears. With your next breath, soften the eyes. Then the jaw. Unclench the jaw, release the tongue. With your next breath, soften your face. Let your face be smooth, your shoulders smooth, your breath smooth. Inhale, expanding the chest and the lungs. Exhale, deepening, rooting, releasing. Inhale and feel your breath extend across your chest, down your arms, down your legs, throughout your body. Exhale, fall deeper into your breath. Sink down. Now let your breath slowly return back to a natural rhythm. And just for a moment, listen to the softness of your breath. Let the next breath be a deep one. And as you exhale, please open up your eyes. So tonight we're going to be reading Dorothy Kidd's essay, Standing Rock in the Indigenous Commons. And this text places the critical commons literature in relation to actual commoning practices that developed in the indigenous anti-extractivist encampment of Standing Rock. The text argues that the mobilization of Standing Rock Sioux is perhaps the best known example of a continent-wide cycle of resistance in which indigenous communities have employed a combination of collectively governed land-based encampments and sophisticated transmedia assemblages to challenge the further enclosure of their territories by the state and fossil fuel industries, and instead represent their political and media sovereignty, and prefigure a more reciprocal relationship with other humans and with nature. Kidd acknowledges that the contemporary indigenous practices of commoning do resemble other radical commoning projects, but they also demand a reassessment of the literary discourse of the commons. In particular, this reassessment must not simply advocate for a blanket return of the commons, but must acknowledge that the physical commons in a settler state belongs to indigenous people. And ignoring that aspect of colonial dispossession and a call for commoning risks becoming complicit in the act of enclosure itself, or in colonial violence. And this article argues that indigenous land-based direct action is crucial to the reclamation of the commons. And the author shows this through the case of Standing Rock particularly. This text is important for our series because in many ways it opens up space for critical, like a critique of the commons. Kidd notes that not all commons are worth defending, nor do all commoning processes necessarily result in an alternative commoner. So new enclaves of community can become actually new sites of enclosure with potential violence in individualist, nationalist, patriarchal, or racist overtones. So we're reminded of a need to reconsider the historical and contemporary particularity of each commons and remain critical of even the commons. Like, what does that mean when somebody's saying the commons? What are they talking about? We discussed this with the World Bank, with Silvia Federici. But I think this text is taking it a step further and saying there can be things that present themselves as anti-capitalist, like the Occupy movement that was actually on settled land. So the text is a little bit long for this week, and I did edit out a section. Most of it remains because I think it's really necessary for the arc of the syllabus and for the conversation. And in the version we'll be reading for today, I also removed the in-text citations because they were really long, but the original edition with the citations and everything is available on the Google Drive. So I'll put that in the chat so you can access that if you want to look at the citations. And thank you in advance for listening to and working through this dense but really important text. I will also place the glossary in the chat like every week. And feel free to ask questions about the glossary. So now I'll pass it to you, Kavi, for the screen share.
Standing Rock and the Indigenous Commons by Dorothy Kidd. Introduction. In April 2016, the Indigenous youth group Respect Our Water started a social media campaign to stop the proposed Dakota Access Oil Pipeline, DAPL, which was threatening to harm their water sources and sacred sites. Thus the hashtags Standing Rock, No DAPL, Mniwikoni, and Water is Life. Soon after, Standing Rock Sioux historian LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, her grandchildren, and other women leaders set up the Camp of the Sacred Stones on their traditional territory as a center for direct action, spiritual resistance, cultural preservation, and defense of Indigenous sovereignty. By the fall of 2016, as many as 20,000 Indigenous and non-Indigenous supporters had joined them to form 3 collectively governed camps with over 1.5 million people actively participating in hundreds of cyberspaces. Led by the Standing Rock Sioux, the land and cyber-based encampments were supported by every single Native American tribe, hundreds of other Indigenous nations from across the Americas and Northern Europe, U.S. military veterans, and a very wide coalition of environmental and social justice movements. The efforts to stop the construction of the Energy Transfer-owned pipeline were unsuccessful, as Donald Trump reinstated the project in his first week as U.S. president in January 2017. Soon after, on February 23, the remaining water protectors were forcibly evicted and the camps evacuated. Nevertheless, Standing Rock has been remarkable for several reasons relevant to this special issue. The mobilization captured more national and international media attention than any previous Indigenous movement in North America. Arguably, they reached far more people with their own self-generated media that challenged neocolonial stereotypes and instead emphasized their long-standing environmental knowledge and opposition to their forced relocation by the extractive industries. Since then, the Standing Rock Sioux have lent their support to several Indigenous-led land-based struggles against extractivism, many of which have drawn on the Standing Rock media power and dubbed themselves as the next Standing Rock.
The Standing Rock Sioux mobilization also begs for a re-examination of the communications commons, including my own previous work. Certainly the Standing Rock encampments resembled other contemporary political projects of radical transformation, informed by the critical commons. Their practices were similarly based on an ethos of caring and collective social transformation, echoing the cardinal idea of commoning, first articulated by Peter Linebaugh, and more recently taken up by a number of other scholars. Paralleling the formations of the Occupy movement, which some commentators had described as a commons, and which in earlier work I had dubbed as a communications commons. The Standing Rock water protectors operated from land-based encampments and articulated and circulated their struggle through a centralized assemblage of all manner of collectively governed communications. Nevertheless, Standing Rock and the current movement of indigenous land-based actions represent some significant differences. Indigenous activists had called out some of these differences during the Occupy movement. Dakota professor Wizia Tawin and Nishanabeg, writer John Paul Montano, among others, argued that the Occupy camps were built on indigenous land, and that if the Occupy movement wanted to further more radical democratic and egalitarian change. They needed to reckon with the long and violent history of colonial dispossession of indigenous peoples and ways of life. Shortly after, Dean scholar Glenn Coulthard wrote that those inclined to advocate a blanket return of the commons as a redistributive counterstrategy to the neoliberal state's new round of enclosures must recognize that the commons in liberal settler states belongs to somebody, the first peoples of this land. Ignoring the injustice of colonial dispossession, he argued not only risks become complicit in the very structures and processes of domination, but also overlooking invaluable glimpses into the ethical practices and preconditions required for the construction of a more just and sustainable world order. As the indigenous commons harbors profound insights into relations within and between human beings and the natural world based on reciprocity, non-exploitation, and respectful coexistence.
Responding to these critical interventions, I am revisiting the communications commons at Standing Rock. This article has biographical, political, and intellectual roots. Part of my family history follows the 19th century trajectory of white colonial settlers across what is now called Canada. I became even more aware of the unbroken link between Indigenous commons and the colonial and contemporary practices of enclosure. And my own status as a white settler when I worked for the Indigenous communications groups in Northern Canada in the 1980s and 1990s. Then in 2011, I listened as scholars Audra Simpson, Glenn Coulthard, and Alfred Key spoke in Vancouver about Indigenous resurgence, projects of art, scholarship, and land-based practices for self-determination. Later in 2015, in a Jacobin magazine interview, Coulthard said that the Indigenous land-based direct action is positioned in a very crucial and important place for radical social change. In settler colonial political economies like Canada, which is still very much based on the extraction and exploitation of natural resources. I proceed in 3 moves. I first discuss Coulthard's concerns about Marxist commons theory and some of the revisions by critical commons theorists who have taken up Indigenous perspectives. Second, I briefly review the literature about Indigenous commons and the colonial era enclosures in North America. I then draw the line forward to the Standing Rock Sioux mobilization, based primarily on the work of historian Nick Estates and Indigenous educator Dina Galeo Whittaker. Next, I examine the commons like formations at Standing Rock, looking especially at the relations among commoners and their practices of commoning. And finally, I discuss the lessons for our understanding of the communications commons.
Colonial era Indigenous Commons. The first historical record of Indigenous commons-based societies in North America is still to be fully written, as are the multiple narratives of resistance to the successive enclosures of European colonial forces, the US and Canada nation states, and the insurrection of white settlers, incursion of white settlers. There were a vast plurality of commons embodying many different systems of production and social reproduction, social norms, institutions, governance, and communications. Each had very specific and distinct geographies produced in and productive of a particular place. For the most part, they operated with practices distinct from the European system of land as privately owned commodity, whose exchange value outweighed its use. Instead, most Indigenous nations did not make property, non-property distinctions, and the very concept of the public domain, invoked by open source activists and those espousing land-based and virtual commons, is alien. Although the pre-colonial Indigenous territories are no longer intact, much of the knowledge of their ecologies and complex systems of collective guardianship, custodianship, and/or stewardship continue to be practiced. Communications were and continue to be key to these processes. Complex protocols govern what, who, when, and how procedures were and are exercised. Distinct from contemporary, free, and open source practices that operate in some contemporary digitally based commons, as Hardison reminds us, the protocols come with clear social restrictions and expectations of obligations from people within the communities and with outsiders. As we will see in the commoning at Standing Rock, many communities developed complex rituals, words, or ceremonial practices to accompany the protocols and record them for posterity. Extractivism is in the settler DNA. Extractivism, or the massive exploitation of natural resources such as gold, silver, minerals, lumber, gas, and oil, was part and parcel of the colonial enclosures of the Indigenous commons and the murder and violent displacement of Indigenous peoples. The governments of both US and Canada provided the military force and financed and implemented tax incentives for the transportation and telecommunications infrastructure to export the raw commodities to Europe and then establish domestic industrial centers. In the US, the doctrine of discovery entrenched the legal groundwork after the fact for the dispossession of Indigenous people and the hyper-exploitation of the natural world. The two nation states of the US and Canada then enacted similar legal regimes that transformed communally stewarded territories into individually, privately held plots of land.
Many Indigenous communities employed multiple strategies for resisting and surviving the forces of enclosure as part of the defense of their collective and life-centered projects of subsistence commoning. Some, including among the Sioux, took up arms, while others signed treaties in the hopes of ensuring peace and rights to land, foodstuffs, healthcare, and education. Throughout the continent, hundreds of communities refused to cede their customs, beliefs, languages, knowledge, and communication systems, even if they often had to take them underground to avoid repression. Many refused to accept the settler logic in which the environment was considered a resource to the exploited rather than a commons to be protected, nurtured, stewarded, and nourished through practices of care. The new enclosures. In Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance, Nick Estes drew a direct line between the struggles of the Sioux over dispossession and enclosure in the 19th century and the encampments of #NoDAPL. Many of the historic leaders and key points in the struggles that he depicts were commemorated in the names, rituals, and prayers of the Standing Rock encampments, as we will see below. The Standing Rock Sioux are Lakota Teton people, part of the Oceti-Sakowin, literally 7 council fires, whose territorial commons once spanned hundreds of miles from the western shores of Lake Superior to the Bighorn Mountains in Montana, and who today number 100,000 to 160,000 people in the US and Canada. The Oceti-Sakowin consistently asserted their political sovereignty and customary ways of living within their territories, despite continuing cycles of dispossession and enclosure. They faced off against the combined onslaughts of the US military and the white settlers from the gold, logging, cattle, and uranium extraction industries, and the massacre of the buffalo on which they depended. Then in 1851 and again in 1868, they negotiated temporary reprieves from the violence with the signing of the 2 Fort Laramie treaties, which notably included the land they were to reoccupy during the #DAPL.
In the last decades of the 19th century, the US state changed tactics. In 1887, the US government further fragmented the Oceti-Sakowin territory into private property, often 160-acre parcels, and attempted to force Indigenous people to adopt settler farming practices via what was called the Sioux Bill. Then in 1889, Congress further subdivided the remaining Sioux territories into 6, one of which was the Standing Rock Reservation. Throughout the 20th century, the Sioux continued to resist each new regime of enclosure. The privatization and control of the water and hydraulical flows for the benefit of settler industry and agriculture dominate the narrative in the first half of the century. Between 1907 and 1934, millions of acres of the remaining Great Sioux Reservation were lost, and even more people were dislocated as their timber, grazing, and agricultural lands were flooded for dams and irrigation systems. In the last half of the 20th century, oil and natural gas exploitation features more prominently. Indigenous resistance to oil pipelines in North America dates back at least to the battle in 1968 against the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and then in the 1970s by the Dene, Inuit, and Métis downstream in the Mackenzie Valley in Canada. Then during the 1980s, oil and natural gas fracking around the world began to be promoted by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank as part of the Washington neoliberal consensus. National governments were strongly encouraged to adopt corporate-friendly laws and taxation policies for extractivist companies, and to deregulate their environmental and labor laws with the argument that potential profits could provide employment, tax revenue, trickle-down wealth, and spill-on effects for local and national economies. No pun intended, spill on. The renewed exploitation of oil and natural gas was stepped up on both sides of the US-Canada border at the turn of the millennium. On the US side, the plan was for the dirty oil from the Bakken shale to be transported more than 1,000 miles across 4 US states via DAPL and other pipelines. On the Canadian side, pipelines carrying the Alberta tar sands oil would crisscross the country and wind south to refineries in the US. Oil and natural gas pipelines are particularly vulnerable to contention as they stretch very long distances and engage a long chain of people through rural and urban, Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. What neither the two governments nor the fossil fuel industry didn't count on was the slow but steadily growing movement among frontline communities and their supporters against the pipelines and the larger ideology of extractivism. In the last decade, communities within the larger Oceti-Sakowin first mobilized against the Keystone XL and then the Dakota Access Pipeline. Many of the campaigns from the Micmac and Elsipogtog on the Atlantic side to the Ojibwe in northern Minnesota and the Wet'suwet'en camps on the pipeline routes to the Pacific coast have been based in land-based struggles in which Indigenous communities have established camps on their own land from which to oppose the pipelines.
The Commons at Standing Rock. In April 2016, 30 young people from Standing Rock set up the Respect Our Water social media campaign to challenge the proposed Dakota Access Pipeline. Tribal historian LaDonna Brave Bull Allard was also concerned that the pipeline would poison their drinking water, harm their fishing and agriculture, and damage their cultural and religious sites. Inspired by the youth, she and her grandchildren and a group of women leaders set up the Sacred Stones camp on Allard's land as a center for cultural preservation and spiritual resistance. They said that they were not protesting, but reclaiming the land that had been stolen from them in violation of the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty and following their longstanding obligations to protect the water. They were thus clearly signaling their autonomy from the US state and extractive capitalist order. At its height in mid-October, #Standing Rock encompassed 3 Indigenous-led encampments with over 20,000 people living in modern tents, trailer homes, or teepees. They set up a council lodge for the Oceti-Sakowin leaders to meet, their first time since 19th century, and significantly, the youth and Two-Spirit representatives were included among the traditional chiefs and elders. On October 24th, they formally proclaimed their territorial sovereignty. Today, the Oceti-Sakowin has enacted an eminent domain on DAPL lands, claiming 851 treaty rights. This is unceded land. If Standing Rock stretched back in time to earlier Oceti-Sakowin commons, they were also reconfiguring the boundaries of their commons and extending their lively ways into cyberspace. Like many Indigenous communities that have been excluded from the commercial telecommunications grid, they skipped over the broadband era and jumped straight to mobile. Adapting lessons from Idle No More, whose aims had also been to protect Indigenous treaties and territories from extractivism, and had been initiated by 3 Indigenous women and 1 settler accomplice. They synergized their on-the-ground encampments with social media communities and allies working in independent media channels. The social media sites provided a scaled-up set of self-governed communication spaces, breaking their isolation, one of the historic tragedies of earlier commons, and working with accomplices from Black Lives Matter. They imagined the hashtag Standing Rock is Everywhere to show the connections between Indigenous people in the US and beyond. Grounded in the land-based mobilization, they used an extensive array of digital media to connect, draw people to the camps, and at the same time, jump scales and fire up decentralized support actions across the country, the continent, and the globe.
The water protectors posted live streams, first-person accounts, photos, and videos via Twitter, Facebook, and other social media from the closest cell phone signal connection that they named Facebook Hill. The creation of online community engaged people in other geographic regions around the world in observing, sharing, and commenting. Importantly, many were inspired to travel to the camps, including some who had never participated in social justice work before, while others carried out direct actions at their own locale. The long-standing systemic marginalization of Indigenous communities by the dominant media meant that the Standing Rock protectors maintained control over communications without much contest until months into the mobilization. So Desiree Kane, a Standing Rock media coordinator, part of what makes this historic is that one of the weapons we have now is our own cameras and our own internet connections to tell our own narratives and stories without having to bow to traditional media outlets that maybe aren't friendly to the cause. Outside media groups were required to report to the media tent, and no photographs were permitted without consent. The media timeline followed what has become the norm for social justice movements since 2011 and the Occupy movement. A small core of Indigenous and non-Indigenous radical media makers, Unicorn Riot, Digital Smoke Signals, Indigenous Rising, Renegade Media, and the Women's Indigenous Media Group supported them from the beginning. Then larger independent media outlets such as Mother Jones and Democracy Now! And Al Jazeera's AJ Plus and Russia Today began to provide regular coverage, especially after a group of young activists organized a relay race to Washington, D.C. in the summer. Not until September, when law enforcement and private security working for Energy Transfer attacked the water protectors with pepper spray, water cannons, and rubber bullets, did the dominant commercial and public service media provide much news coverage. The BBC was the first major news outlet to provide any detail. With no reporters on site, the US corporate news outlets often reported information secondhand from the police and state authorities. However, by that point, the water protectors had over 1 million active followers on their social media accounts, a powerful force in refuting the narrative produced by the police and then echoed by some of the dominant media. The significance of these allied cyber commons and their virtual media power was clearly demonstrated at several different moments throughout the autumn months. In October 2016, when the Morton County Sheriff's Department was allegedly monitoring Facebook check-ins to identify water protectors at the site, Facebook supporters were asked to check in a show of solidarity. Over 1.5 million people responded. Regardless of the effectiveness in curbing the police surveillance, as Deem argues, the mass check-ins reconstituted virtual and the analog in tandem, providing a disembodied presence that lent visibility to the bodies on the ground in a very particular local place. Then on November 15th, 2016, the hashtag NoDAPL Day of Action drew tens of thousands of demonstrators in 300 solidarity events in all 50 US states, with 7,000 in Washington, D.C., and dozens of other world centers, including London, Paris, Toronto, Auckland, Kyoto, and Marrakesh. The physical mobilization of supporters across the country and the world who participated in the NoDAPL Day of Action demonstrates the power of social media to elicit direct participation and empower movements in ways that were previously impossible.
Commoners. Hashtag Standing Rock represented a very different composition of commoners in scope and scale than the previous radical commons. First, it was based in national and transnational indigenous networks. At the center, all 7 Oceti Sakowin nations symbolically and materially aided them, despite the fact that members of the Manda Hidatas and Arikara or MHA nation, whose land is also affected by the pipeline, supported oil production, with some working in the oil fields. Every single Native American nation gave their support, as did many senior activists from the American Indian movement. In addition, they were supported by 380 indigenous nations from around the world, many of which have been actively involved in the resistance to extractivism. Second, Standing Rock youth drew from earlier movements of Idle No More and Black Lives Matter. They encouraged allies from other anti-racist, anti-colonial collectives, as well as creative cross-racial and transnational mobilizations and mediated forms of representation. Together with the women elders, they took major steps in recognizing the leadership of women and two-spirited people in camp life and direction. Third, Standing Rock represented a new relationship with non-Indigenous environmental movements and other settler-led social and political movements. Previously, many Indigenous mobilizations have been subsumed under the white settler-dominated environmental movement, which have not recognized the critical importance of Indigenous sovereignty, land, and rights. The Standing Rock Sioux encouraged the participation of non-Indigenous allies and accomplices, but their expectation was that everyone should follow their protocols and norms. These changes in leadership were not without significant tensions and contradictions, which I discussed further below. Fourth, their marshaling of hybrid communications expanded both the scope and scale of their campaign and of the larger Indigenous-led extra activist movement. 2,000 veterans, many of whom were Indigenous, answered the call on social media and showed up to support the water protectors. Musicians and celebrities also participated by creating music videos, some of which attracted millions of viewers on YouTube and other platforms. The hashtag NoDAPL Day of Action on November 15, 2016, a decentralized event largely organized via social media, demonstrated the connection among locally organized groups across the US and the planet. Since then, several Indigenous-led land-based struggles against extractivism have drawn on the Standing Rock media power and called themselves the next Standing Rock. Commenting, the efforts of the Standing Rock Sioux to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline featured a range of strategies, from legal actions and political lobbying at the local courthouse, state capitol, and in Washington, to cross-country relays, direct and active resistance to the construction of the pipeline, and the extensive decolonizing media activist practices. The 3 encampments provided the hub for many of the above practices. Regular assemblies included everyone in collective reflection and decision-making. The collective living spaces provided opportunities for multiple informal encounters that nurtured relations of mutuality with fellow commoners, allowed for conversation, and for envisioning alternative ways of organizing society. Nick Estes describes the ethos of intergenerational caregiving and generosity in the daily collective practices of the main camp as benefiting a fully functioning city. Under the direction of the Standing Rock Sioux elders, a steady rotation of young Indigenous men kept the fires going. Several free camp kitchens provided 3 meals a day, and a donations tent equipped with clothes, tents, and essentials to keep everyone warm, an essential service during the winter cold. Two-spirited activists led some of the prayers and the marches and participated in the camp council, in the school, and security food preparations, and asmetics.
Commoning practices at Standing Rock reasserted traditional Sioux practices. Key among these was prayer. Every morning in the Sacred Stone camp, the water protectors prayed, fed the sacred fire, and shared their food with their ancestors. The ground rules and action principles were posted throughout the camp saying, "Water is sacred. We are peaceful and prayerful. This is a ceremony. Act accordingly." Reasserting these traditional practices strengthened kinship relations and brought Oseti Sakowin youth closer to traditional Lakota and Dakota culture. Embracing non-human beings and formations such as the water and earth, they changed the language and practice of contention off and online. The hashtag Miniwakoni, water is life, embodies the understanding that water is a material resource which is essential for health, wellness, irrigation, and human survival, and amplified their message and identification as water protectors, not protesters, again, emphasizing caring and solidarity, not conflict. Anti-colonial education was also a key dimension of recovering their knowledge commons after centuries of erasure. A fully functioning day school was facilitated by an unprecedented concentration of Indigenous knowledge keepers, with anti-colonial curriculum about Indigenous treaties, language, song, dance, math, history, nonviolent direct action, and water defense. Some of the younger Indigenous women linked the local oil boom to the corruption of tribal councils and the subsequent increase of drug use, sex trafficking, sexual violence, and they focused their work on teaching and healing with youth against the ravages of alcoholism, suicide, and abuse. The media collectives such as Indigenous Rising and Indigenous Rising Media set important examples of decolonizing media representation, reshaping the Indigenous subject in the national and global imaginary, and representing a radical form of visual sovereignty. Indigenous Rising Media emphasize community, land-based activity, creativity, and everyday resistance in their portrayal of camp life. They created new visual formats for digital channels that challenged Western narratives, deliberately avoiding colonialist tropes of vast and uninhabited landscapes and warriors on horseback, and instead recombining older historical imaginaries with contemporary media aesthetics. For example, Indigenous Rising Media created several Facebook albums that traced their connection to their anti-colonial area resistance, one of which honors Brenda Whitebull, the granddaughter of Sitting Bull, who last brought the Sioux tribes together against the US government at the end of the 19th century. The Standing Rock encampments were far from conflict-free. There was, as one might expect, a continuing tension over tactics in the encampments. Some participants challenged the tribal leadership and carried out more direct actions, such as blocking the construction machinery. There were also tensions over gender roles and dress. The elders' dress protocol for ceremony included full-length skirts, and they expected all women to comply. By the fall, women in pants were encouraged to wear full-length skirts. The virtual commons also reflected major differences in political strategies. as many of the participants operated within a discourse of climate change and environmental accountability separated from Indigenous rights and perspectives.
The Standing Rock encampments provided the space and time for people to grow new collective imaginaries and develop narratives to spread them. At Standing Rock, participants constructed these new collective imaginaries through a complex process that combined group education and critique about the resource industry's plans and the US government's role in enclosing and displacing the Oceti-Sakowin, and at the same time, their own historical memories of iconic leaders and collective resistance, and of how to live together in their own territories. The hybrid networks of on-offline communicative spaces allowed, as communication scholar Merlina Lim has written, for a collective imaginary about Indigenous history and environmental knowledge and governance to emerge from a process that was both cognitive and corporeal, and which involved a specific political focus as well as more everyday concerns. The Standing Rock encampments were ultimately disbanded in early 2017 and the pipeline completed. Nevertheless, their mobilization has rippled across the continent and beyond. In the ensuing years, several European banks financing DAPL have sold their shares and have abandoned further projects with Energy Transfer as a result of the connection made with Sami performers at the Sacred Fire of Oceti-Sakowin. In March 2020, the Standing Rock Sioux won a significant victory when a federal court judge ordered the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to conduct an extensive environmental review of the pipeline, with a further decision about a temporary shutdown until the review is completed, expected sometime later in 2020. Several other Indigenous-led land-based struggles against extractivism across the US and Canada, in Norway and Eastern India have invoked the Standing Rock media power. Much more needs to be elaborated on the Indigenous Commons and on the lessons for other radical communications commons. Not all commons, it is important to note, are worth defending, nor do all commoning processes necessarily result in an alternative commoner. In a context of power inequalities, we cannot assume that more face-to-face communication necessarily leads to cooperation. Indeed, it may contribute to increasing aggression. New enclaves of community can become new sites of enclosure, with potential violence in individualist, nationalist, patriarchal, or racist overtones. There is thus a need to consider the historical and contemporary particularity of each commons, the systems of governance that are always in the making, as well as the contradictions and fluidity of identities among commoners.
Standing Rock begs for several correctives to the Radical Commons framework. First, the Standing Rock Sioux water protectors were not protesters coming anew to private or public land, but were reestablishing collective sovereignty on territories that had been violently taken from them. Their commoning practices were based in re-encoding legacy knowledges and protocols that had been systematically invisibilized. As Fortier argued, this behooves us and future tactical commons organizers to challenge the settler notion of rural and urban space as terra nullius, or empty of indigenous sovereign presence, and instead learn from and take direction from indigenous peoples in their territories. In extension, this also means always carefully considering the residual movements wherever new commons are formed. Secondly, Standing Rock challenged some of the simplistic ideas of horizontalism in which egalitarian leadership is said, as with the Occupy movement, to develop ad hoc, in situ, and open to all. At Standing Rock, supporters from other Indigenous and non-Indigenous nations were welcome to participate on the condition that they recognize Standing Rock leadership and followed camp rules. In addition, there was a recognition of women and LGBTQ people who were centrally involved as part of the leadership of day-to-day routines and within the Oceti Sakowin Council. In future commons, one of the first steps will need to be to formulate governance structures that acknowledge power differences and support an intersectional shift in power relations. Thirdly, Standing Rock highlighted Indigenous practices of reciprocity with nature and all sentient beings. They challenged colonial, anthropomorphic, gendered, and racialized knowledges and behaviors, and instead collectively built qualitatively different social relations and generative practices which emphasized cooperation and responsibility to each other and to the water, earth, forests, animals, and the sea. The future to which both Estes and Coulthard point is a more complete ecological perspective about human and non-human relations and the necessary protocols to survive.
That ends the reading for this week. And so we'll stop here, but thank you everyone for reading along and listening along. Before we move on to the next section, just wanted to provide a kind of brief overview of the recent developments around the pipeline. As stated in the text, the pipeline started operation in 2017 by Texas-based Energy Transfer. Meanwhile, legal efforts from the Standing Rock Sioux, represented by attorney Jan Hasselman from Earth Justice, have been ongoing since 2016 to stop its operation. The Obama administration originally rejected permits for the project, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers prepared to conduct a full environmental review. And in 2017, Donald Trump took office, and the agency scrapped the review and granted permits, concluding that running the pipeline into the Missouri River posed no significant environmental issues. The current Biden administration has refused to intervene. Recent developments have been centered around the environmental reviews stated, and the Earth Justice and the Standing Rock Sioux are asking for the pipeline to stop operations while a full environmental review is conducted by the Army Corps. U.S. District Judge James Boasberg, who's been overseeing the case for 5 years, said in April 2020 that more extensive review was necessary than the environmental assessment conducted by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Meanwhile, in February 2020, North Dakota regulators unanimously approved expanded capacity for the pipeline with construction of new pumping stations. In April 2021, Army Corps of Engineers and the lawyers for the pipeline asked for more time to delay the environmental review. And most recently, in June of 2021 of this year, the U.S. District Judge James Boasberg dismissed one of the lawsuits by the Standing Rock Sioux challenging the operation of the Dakota Access Pipeline, but outlined a path for future legal challenge with the result of the ongoing environmental review. The judge concluded that the tribe had failed to demonstrate a likelihood of irreparable injury from the line's continued operation, as a direct quote from the judge. Attorneys from the Standing Rock Sioux and other tribes say the pipeline is operating illegally without a federal permit granting easements across beneath Lake Oahe, Missouri River Reservoir near the Standing Rock Reservation that is maintained by the Corps. Today, the pipeline transports over 750,000 barrels of oil daily, and the expanded environmental impact study is still ongoing. The future of shutting down the pipeline hinges on the results of that study, and we're waiting that as in the kind of the future of the lawsuits going forward as well. So I'll pass it over to you, Izzy.
Thank you so much for those updates, Copy. So before we get into discussion, I'm just going to read a couple discussion points. So I think what this article does that some of the earlier texts in this series do to a certain extent, but not as explicitly as this text does, is question the contemporary conversations that are happening about the commons that aren't necessarily centering the historical and situated conditions. The commons are more than just this kind of mystical space or energy we call upon, although I do believe that the sacred and the magical is embedded into the commons. We must recognize that the commons are contingent upon material struggle, material relations, material history. Of course, this materiality interplays with the mystical, but it's rooted in historical relations. As Kidd states, the Standing Rock Sioux Commons and water protectors were not protesters coming anew to private or public land, but were reestablishing collective sovereignty on territories that had been violently taken from them. Their commoning practices were based in re-encoding legacy knowledges and protocols that had been systematically invisibilized. So as I mentioned in the intro, Kidd argues that not all commons are worth protecting and not all commoning practices will lead to this like radical alternative community, and that some in fact further reproduce and reinstate enclosures and racism. So I just wanted to raise those points from the article and ask openly what everyone thinks about this, ask if this text has challenged your thinking with the commons, and if so, how, and in what ways is Standing Rock Sioux Commons different or similar to the commons we've read about. So I'll put those discussion points in the chat. Also, if you want to just talk more broadly about Standing Rock and yeah, anything related to the text, of course, that's welcome too. Thanks, everyone. I'll open the floor to discussion.
I mean, I've read so much about Standing Rock because I had been there in September 2016, and I had also attended when David Archambault, who was the chairman at the time of the Standing Rock Reservation, when he came to DC to make those challenges at the DC Superior Court. I was there too. So I've read so much, but I've never read a summary article like this that puts it in the context of really like gathering together all the pieces that showed how there was this digital like commoning that happened that was transformational, I think, in US history. So for that reason, I think this was a really great article choice, because that was really a watershed moment, I think, in the consciousness of US Americans, for sure, about the presence of Indigenous people on this land and their legitimacy and their voice in reshaping what land management meant. And I also say at the time I was involved in federal agencies who, you know, whenever there's an interstate infrastructure like an oil pipeline, there is a requirement for every federal agency that's involved to provide a consultation, to provide an impact assessment of how that interstate infrastructure impacts their domain. And so in a way, I had been involved in the previous pipeline, Keystone XL, where Obama had made the determination that it did not provide as many jobs. And so he said, he said, let's not go forward with the Keystone XL because it really doesn't have the economic benefit that you would imagine for this pipeline. So the oil industry had said, oh, this is going to be great. But when it actually came down to it. There were very few jobs created. All it was a conveyance from the Bakken oil shale fields in Canada to Louisiana. And so we took all of the environmental risk and there were very few benefits. So on that sort of cold, it was a very settler colonial calculus made about the pipeline. And on that basis, Keystone had been rejected by the Obama administration. And then the Dakota Access came up, and the same process where the US Army Corps, who manages these interstate infrastructures, has no mechanism for the language that the indigenous people came forward with about, you know, about the whole unity of environmental relationship with the land. In their narrow framework, they just had this idea of, oh, how does it impact indigenous communities? And so we were always, you know, I was there on the front lines when they were digging with their backhoes, and the indigenous communities were like, these are sort of former campgrounds of our ancestors. These are places where people's bones are, and there are fire rings here because our communities camped here. And that's absolutely true. They were nomadic across that vast landscape. And so they were trying to advance that argument to block the pipeline. And they don't, you know, the fossil fuel industry and the US Army Corps of Engineers have no respect for that. There is just violence against indigenous people on this continent. And so they have no place in their language to even hear that this is the footprint of our ancestors. Yeah, so the whole thing is very disturbing to me, but it continues to this day, as Kavi was saying, that the language of the US Army Corps and the entire US government language is for the furtherance of their own profit and not to understand the worldview, nor the territorial claims of the indigenous people.
You said so much there. I'm really taking it all in right now. There's a lot to process. But the part about the language is really accurate. And I think last week we talked about that with Vandana Shiva and the text on seed, and how there's just actually not the words to describe. And it's interesting that with hashtag Standing Rock, like there's now this kind of like, it's interesting to think about the role of the internet and media, and how these like media commons, how they can maybe, okay, on the one hand, it gives a platform for people, for alternative, like we're telling our story through the media. We're not going through, like, it's not being just put out there by these mass media conglomerates, but it's coming through like our own like Facebook Hill or Facebook Mountain, I forget what it's called, but it makes me wonder, like, to what extent things are lost, to what extent things are able to actually be portrayed more so accurately, and then linguistically, like the gaps that might happen through this kind of internet commons. What are the limitations? What are the benefits? You know, and there's a cute little baby.
I mean, that Facebook Hill was really crucial because, as the article clearly says, the historical precedent was of, you know, territorial isolation, and certainly was extremely isolated. And Facebook Hill was literally a little mound along the rolling plains of North Dakota where you could get a tiny signal, and through that tiny signal you were posting on Facebook, because once you came down to the camp there was no signal there. So it was a real hill actually. And digital smoke signals was mentioned in this. Myron Dewey you know, there was severe like physical and they were in physical danger. People who flew drones to show the action, to show the way that the water cannon were used, they were, it was like the CIA and the FBI and the military were, you know, were sent out against these people. And Myron Dewey was recently, he was killed in a mysterious car crash on the Nevada border because he had been doing the same kind of Standing Rock surveillance drone footage and posting it on the media for a recent, another Standing Rock where there's now a you know, this is for greenwashing, a lithium mine that wants to be opened in on the remote Nevada Oregon border, and he had been filming there and he was disappeared. You know, a car crash, you know, that's a code word in our world, because we know what, you know, we know how violently they were stalked and intimidated by the police forces, the US cops there. And I mean, I have my own experience with the North Dakota, the cops. I mean, everyone who went there was traumatized to some extent, you know.
Yeah, and that's when I wonder about the limitations of social media as like this traceable, I mean, the revolution will not be televised. Like there's degrees of like transparency that are important in showing, look, this is happening. There's something happening here. We are here, we're reclaiming this space. Come join us, support us, recognize and acknowledge what's going on. But then another degree of like the ability of the state and the police and the, you know, the scary surveillance that can then track and follow, and then suddenly you've like this person's disappeared mysteriously or gotten into a car crash mysteriously, etc. So yeah, those are just questions with social media and the internet that are scary and hard to navigate.
I think something sort of interesting just in relation to like the use of the internet as a common space. I'm like I said, I have not really been here for previous discussions, so I don't know how much you all have focused on I don't know, internet platforms in the commons, but I just think that something I've discussed before is just like how the internet is so good at, I think, like making us feel like it is a neutral space in many cases, but it is like fully governed by capitalism and by like these institutions and like corporations, I think. And that just oftentimes there's just sort of an invisible like skewed interest that just undergirds everything and like undergirds every platform that people use to communicate. So I think that's also just like very relevant in terms of thinking of like the danger that people are put in and the different interests at play when people use those platforms to communicate.
Does anyone have any thoughts on like, you know, in the past we've talked about the commons, and this text explicitly highlights that when we talk about the commons, like there's a necessity to acknowledge that we're building commons on Indigenous land, and like how the Occupy movement, it was always like limited in that lack. I don't know, I found that to be a really important point to kind of like add depth to the discussions we've been having, because that's something that like I think we all have maybe for the most part like implicitly thought of, but haven't actually like stated like, okay, we're claiming the commons, but then like what about the people who have like that is their land? How do we navigate that? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I want to just say how there's multiple levels of this colonial commons, because the Obama administration had very slick wording to cover this issue. They said that the US Army Corps had to, for every project, had to go into deep, extensive consultation with indigenous people because some of their land is affected. So you can't just do an economic analysis, lay down a pipeline and go forward. You have to do a consultation. And that would, I presume, address this issue that, this is actually indigenous land. But when it comes down to it, a consultation is just a word on paper. And the larger motivation of the US Army Corps to enable commerce across state borders has been the precedent of convention in the United States, and it continues to be their bureaucratic practice. And I think if Lauren's on, we had a quick conversation about this yesterday about the conventions inside bureaucracies. So on paper, yes, it looks like there's consultations with indigenous communities, but when it comes down to it, it's a lip service. And what actually happens is a very cursory and the official language that would be written in an environmental impact statement would be just sterile, it would be neutered, it would be absolutely colorless, but it would say, yes, we have consulted with the indigenous communities, but it would be extremely unsatisfactory to the worldview of the indigenous people, to their actual concerns, such as the pipeline going through that lake that is their source of fishing and their source of drinking water. It causes enormous harm, but there's always a way in the administrative and bureaucratic machinery of the United States to say that they're doing the right thing and then absolutely not meet any intention behind that. So that's really insidious. And in a way, Obama was just playing sort of rhetorical football with this, and Trump just came and laid the curtain bare. He's like, this is what the United States does, sign off on it, And as well, I think that there is a current concern about any infrastructure in the US government that has impact for fossil fuels, because a pipeline means that it's a long-term investment in fossil fuels. Already in 2017, there was a requirement for any infrastructure to be evaluated against how much does it commit to our fossil fuel future and to think about the climate. That as well is interpreted in a very loose way. It sounds good rhetorically, but in practice, this country is oriented towards making commerce and property and exploitation possible for private entrepreneurs. And that's what happens at the end of the day. But it's, but there are things on paper that say, oh yeah, we have to do an impact analysis. Ultimately, it's meaningless. I'm sorry to be so negative, but that's what it comes down to.
No, I appreciate your honesty, and I'm sure everyone else does as well. So I wish we had more time to chat. Emily's going to get started on her sound bath soon. I just want to mention before we move on to that portion that next week we'll be reading about building the commons, the infrastructure of the commons, and then artistic practices and commoning in artistic practices. So it's actually, the texts are written by one of my old professors who's a Turkish architect and like social thinker and anarchist. She's really amazing. So I will now pass it on to Emily, and thank you all for being here tonight and for sharing and listening. Thank you, Emily. Good night, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Good night.